Now I'm going to talk about budgets and budgeting. So, what is a budget? For the government or a government, a budget is a forecast of revenues and expenditures. Budgets are forecast over a fiscal year, and different governments have different fiscal years. State and local governments, typically, the fiscal year begins on July 1st and goes then to the end of June. And they're named after the year in which they end. So this is being recorded in October of 2020. So what fiscal year are we in for the state of Maryland's budget? Well, if it began on July 1st and it ends at the end of June, and we're in October, and they're named after the year they end in, right now we are in fiscal year 2021, even though it's still in the calendar year 2020. The federal government's fiscal year is actually even more complicated than that. The federal government's fiscal year begins October 1st. So we're in fiscal year 2021 for the federal government as well, now that we're past October 1st. But just 2 weeks ago, we were in the fiscal year of 2020 for the federal government because we were still in September. The reason that they're staggered like this is because those governments have to meet and determine the budget, and so they meet in the spring. The Maryland General Assembly is in the spring. The Congress is supposed to be passing and providing a budget, developing a budget in the spring, and you need time between when you decide what the budget's going to be and when the budget's going to take place. And for whatever reason, I don't know the history of it, but initially it was not staged, probably because the lag between when the state government, anyway, when they meet and the end of the calendar year is pretty long, and the economy can change between their spring meeting, because our state government only meets in the spring, unless they have what's called a special session. They only meet, they finish in April every year. There's a long time between April and the end of the calendar year, but there's less time between April and July 1st. So I think that's why they do it at the state level. Why at the federal level? Probably it's because of when they first started doing it that way. That's just the way it was, and changing it would then cause there to be a long span or a short span, which maybe wouldn't be too bad since the federal government has gone a number of years in the past 20 without actually even passing a federal budget. They have funded their operations by continuing resolutions. And these are often the things that have, if you've heard of government shutdowns or looming government shutdowns, these have been the results of fights over continuing resolutions as to how to fund the government because of the failure to produce budgets back in the spring. That's a little bit of my own soapbox, but it also happens to be what has happened. When we're talking about budgets, very often we're talking about budget deficits. And I think most people know what a budget deficit is. They just have never thought about it in depth. So that's what we have to do here, right? A budget deficit is something that's going to be occurring whenever what exceeds what? A budget deficit will be occurring when what exceeds what? It must be that expenditures or outlays, as it's often called in government accounting, outlays exceed income, or in government accounting, what's called revenue. If outlays exceed revenue, you have a budget deficit. You're spending more than you're bringing in. That's a deficit. The federal government has had a federal budget deficit every year of my life, except for fiscal year 2020 fiscal year 2000, or 1999, right in there, we actually had what's called a budget surplus. And of course, that would be then when revenues exceed outlays. That's only happened for one or maybe two, but I think just 1 year since I've been alive. And the deficit spending had gone on well before I was alive. I'm not sure the last year, I think it was in the 1950s, there had been a budget surplus, but I'd have to look that up. I don't know, and it doesn't matter because it's so long ago. It's probably not very relevant. Just as a rule of thumb, the federal government runs with a federal budget deficit. They spend more than they bring in every year. Now, around that 1 or 2 years where we actually had a federal budget surplus, there's a fair amount of misinference or even misimplication of what that means. We all hear about the federal debt, right? You hear the growing federal debt. Well, what makes a federal debt grow? Two things. Spending more than you bring in, which is deficit spending, and the interest expense. Because you have to pay interest on money that you owe, right? Debt is money that you owe. The federal debt is currently about the size of the economy, just over $20 trillion. We have to pay interest as taxpayers on that owed money, just like you or I would have to pay interest on money we owe. So, as this continues to grow, the interest obligation continues to grow. That's probably the big problem with the federal debt. But I want to clear up the misinformation about the 1 or 2 years that we had a federal budget surplus. The budget surplus existing in the late 90s is not the same as the debt going away. That's just 1 or 2 years of not adding to it. And that's all we've had. The debt was still there. The debt was still collecting obligated, or still had obligated interest. It just wasn't a greater debt for a very short period of time in my life. But for the rest of my life, the federal government debt has been growing because deficits have continued year after year after year. It's like this. If you or I spend more than we bring in, we're deficit spending. What does that result in? Debt. We owe for what we did. If we did that for a year, and then the next year we brought in more than we spent, we could use that additional amount to pay down what we owed, but we still owed it. We're still obligated to that. That's the difference between debt and deficit. So that's a little bit about what budgets are. And now I have some information in my notes more specifically about our state and federal budgets, how those monies are allocated. The federal government, it's from 2018. I haven't updated this in a while, but these things don't change really overnight. We listed the different types of taxes. Well, corporate income taxes, which have received a lot of attention because of the Trump tax cuts, only actually make up, in 2018, 11.5% of the receipts of the federal government. Individual income taxes, which is the primary source of revenue for the federal government, looks like 49.1% in 2018 was how much of the federal revenues came from income taxes. Social Security taxes, if we count them as a source of federal revenue, would be 31.3% of it. And again, comparing the relatively small amount of corporate income taxes that I mentioned, something listed as other is 8.1. So corporate income taxes are only 3% more than other. On the state side, on our state of Maryland, state and local revenues come from property taxes, as I mentioned, which is a little hard for me to see in my notes. That looks like 15.3%. The sales, excise, and gross receipts tax for the state of Maryland are 18.5% of state revenues. And then the personal and corporate income taxes are 14.8%. So they're roughly 15% each. The sales tax and the income taxes, they're neck and neck for Maryland's largest source of revenue. And that might actually go back and forth depending on the state of the economy, all else held constant. But they're roughly the same. Most states, the primary source of revenue, I would say most states, is also income taxes. but we do have a 6% sales tax in the state of Maryland. Other is actually bigger than that. It's 28.3%. Money from the federal government to the state, generally refer to this as grants, is 21.7% of Maryland's revenues. So we get more money from the federal government than we actually do from our income taxes in the state of Maryland, at least as of fiscal year. I got this in 2018. It was fiscal year 2017. So one thing I need to point out about the idea of balanced budgets, because by my tone and the obligated interest that I mentioned, might sound like that's a terrible idea to have debt or to allow governments to deficit spend. Economists are generally actually opposed to what are called balanced budget, or at least for the federal government, are generally opposed to what's called a balanced budget amendment. The idea of a balanced budget amendment would be that the federal government would be required to bring in the same amount that they spend each year. It sounds really nice, because then we wouldn't be racking up the interest obligation that we are. You see, by the way, the interest obligation, each year that we raise that amount, how much we owe the people we owe money to, that's money that either has to come from the taxpayers and thus be pulled out of the economy, or from other federal programs. So it hurts to have this interest obligation, right? But what's the upside? Well, most states, all but I think 2 or 3, I'm sure we could quick Google that to find out what they are. It really doesn't matter. It's not the state of Maryland. Maryland is one of those most states, have what's called a balanced budget amendment in their state constitution, which means that the state, between the legislature and the governor, each year have to produce a budget in which revenues match outlays or exceed outlays. They can't have outlays exceed revenues. They cannot deficit spend by their own state law. Of course, there's not a lot that can be done about it except by the people if they violate that, but that's what it is. That's what it's supposed to be, and that's how it's supposed to work. So what does that mean when we have a recession in the state of Maryland? Well, a recession is poor economic times. We all have a feel for that, right? We'll elaborate that when we get more to that specific topic, but just know this is bad times. Well, during bad times, what's happening to people's jobs? They're going away, people are being laid off. Well, if governments get their revenue from incomes, and incomes are going away, what does that mean about government's revenues? They're falling. Well, the state of Maryland also gets income from sales taxes. What do you suppose is happening to sales and consumption during a recession? That's falling. So the state of Maryland's revenue is falling during bad economic times. Well, if they're responsible for having a balanced budget, what does that mean they have to do to their expenses? They have to cut those. That means laying people off or furloughing people, not paying people, state employees. What does that do to the employment situation during the already bad employment situation? It makes it worse. So that's why generally economists don't support the idea of the federal government also having a balanced budget amendment, because during recessions, the federal government doesn't have to do that. The federal government can go ahead and even spend more money to stimulate the economy, as we saw in 2009. Or they can cut taxes to stimulate the economy, as we saw in 2002. Both of those things reduce the federal government's revenue or raise the federal government's expenses. Both of those things increase the deficit, but they employ people, right? Just outright employment in the sense of stimulating the economy by spending money, or putting more money in people's pockets by cutting taxes, which they go out and spend on things, which employs people in the private economy. So this is something that we have, this is called fiscal policy. These are the policy tools that the federal government has, and state governments have it too, except the state governments have their hands tied by balanced budget amendments. So if the federal government also had a balanced budget amendment, they wouldn't really have those tools as well at their disposal to address bad economic times when they occur. So that's why economists are generally opposed to a balanced budget amendment in spite of the growing debt. I think that's a fairly decent breaking point, so I'm going to stop this piece and start up with another piece